Well, guys, there's been a development. A couple of months ago, I think, I don't really know to be honest, I sort of lose track of time these days. We talked about a pretty big TikToker who was arrested on suspicions of murder. And a couple of days ago, he was indicted by a grand jury on first-degree murder, and now he is potentially gonna face the death penalty. Pretty bad day for him, I'd imagine. It was a pretty big story when it happened, and I haven't really seen anybody talk about these recent developments, so here we are. Now, if you missed the original video, or if you just didn't hear about this when it happened, basically, a TikToker named Mr. Prada, whose claim to fame was like kind of just stealing other people's content. Not entirely, but like really what helped him get so big is that he would copy basically any TikTok that went viral. So when a TikTok went viral, people would comment like waiting on Mr. Prada to copy this or something to that effect, and it got a lot of people talking about him. Pretty weird way to blow up, but I mean, if it works, right? That's not really what's important here. What's important here is that in September, Mr. Prada was arrested after being caught driving a stolen vehicle, the vehicle of a man who was recently murdered. If I recall correctly, there was an attempt to pull him over, which failed. He fled to Texas and was eventually caught by the authorities. Now, when this first went down, obviously, there was still a lot up in the air about what actually happened, but over the past few months, there's been a lot of evidence collected, and it really looks like Mr. Prada did this. There are apparently witnesses who saw him struggling to move a blue tarp that the victim's body was later found in. A search of Mr. Prada's apartment found weapons and what was described as a large amount of blood. Again, he was driving this man's car, ran from the police. It's not looking too good. Now, there's a lot of what if surrounding this case that we'll get into a little bit, but I don't really want to speculate. I'm going to a little bit because I think some of the context surrounding this case is pretty important, because it seems like there might be a few missing pieces of the puzzle. The big story here is that a while back, there was an investigation into the man who was murdered, where he was accused of inappropriately touching one of his patients. He was a therapist. It was 10 years ago, and the patient who accused this man of doing this is the same age as Mr. Prada, lived in the same city. There are a lot of strange links between these two that really can't be ignored after one murders the other. The way this therapist was murdered was described as extremely brutal, and it seems like it would be one crazy fucking coincidence for Mr. Prada to have just decided to do this for no reason. Also, this happened inside of Mr. Prada's apartment. Why would this therapist be there if there wasn't some sort of prior relationship? It is pretty weird. The attorneys involved said that there's no link between Mr. Prada and that old investigation. They've gone on the record saying that Mr. Prada was not the child who accused this man of doing this. So, I mean, you've kind of got to go with that, but like, all the pieces of the puzzle here aren't really fitting. Looks like we might be building the wrong picture. You know what I mean? Obviously, the prosecution is going to try and paint this like there was no prior relationship or anything. I don't find myself going to the apartment of people I don't know very often. Feel like that's probably the case for most people. There's something that is not being disclosed yet. And look, I'm not saying that like anything would necessarily justify this. However, the way that like news outlets are covering this, I feel like we're missing out on some crucial details. Like, it seems like there's an attempt to paint this as just some random murder, which look, I'm not a detective. I'm not investigating this. It could be. It really doesn't seem that way though. Just my 2 cents. Anyways, Mr. Prada is heading to trial after a jury has decided that there was enough evidence to charge him, and he's being charged with first-degree murder, aggravated criminal damage to property, obstruction of justice, and unauthorized use of a motor vehicle. And like mentioned earlier, since he's being tried in Louisiana, he could and probably will face the death penalty if he's convicted, given the extraordinarily violent nature of the murder. Now, I use the phrase "if convicted" pretty generously, I think. There's honestly not a snowball's chance in hell that this guy is not found guilty. There's witnesses saying they saw him dragging the tarp around, the victim's blood was found all over his apartment, and he was driving the guy's car. I think the only possible way Mr. Prada gets off here is maybe the jury thinks second-degree murder would have been more appropriate, which, if you watch my original video, or if you've been following this case, you might remember that originally Mr. Prada was charged with second-degree murder, but according to an article I found, apparently it was up to first-degree murder based off of the victim's age, which, I don't really know how that works or why that works that way, but the more you know. But I mean, to be honest, it does kind of seem like this motherfucker had no plan whatsoever, left the dude's blood all over his apartment, and then drove his stolen car. Like, I mean, it was almost like he was trying to get caught. Doesn't exactly seem like there was a lot of premeditation here, but I don't think that argument's really gonna work. Now, this case and everything that surrounds it has opened up a lot of discourse on TikTok and especially Twitter regarding the issue of vigilante justice, which I mean is always like a super productive thing to try and talk about on the internet, but obviously a lot of people are upset that Mr. Prada is facing the death penalty when everything surrounding this case sort of points towards the likelihood of something happening between this therapist and Mr. Prada in the past. Now, I don't really want to get into the topic of vigilante justice, but we're going to. In my opinion, it's really never justifiable, but sometimes it is understandable. I think that's a distinction a lot of people aren't willing to make. I mean, taking the law into your hands is the slipperiest of slippery slopes. Like, it's just one of those things in a civilized society that you just can't make justifiable. You can't make it okay, because things start to run downhill extremely quickly if you do. So like, I mean, I can't really justify vigilante justice, but in certain cases, I can understand it. However, it seems like the internet is doing the thing that the internet likes to do in situations like this, and that's just ignoring anything that goes against the popular narrative. And as much as it makes sense, as much as it seems intuitive, we can't just assume that there was some sort of relationship between this therapist and Mr. Prada. It would be kind of insane if there wasn't, given like how this went down, but right now officials are saying that they don't believe that Mr. Prada was ever a client of this therapist, which again seems like really hard to believe, but that doesn't really mean you don't get to believe it, you know what I mean? And I know a lot of people are gonna say, oh, you shouldn't trust the authorities, the justice system sucks, and like, yeah, you're right. But also, sometimes people just do crazy shit for really no good reason. Now look, don't get me wrong, I'm not saying that that's what I think happened here, but it is possible. In my opinion, unlikely, but it is possible. When stuff like this happens with celebrities or influencers, people that a lot of people follow, keep up with, feel like they really know, I feel like for some it hits a lot closer to home. But it's important to remember that you don't actually know these people, you just know their online persona. You just don't know what they're capable of, and you don't know where their head was at. Just because you really like them doesn't necessarily mean that they killed a person for a good reason. Gotta keep that in mind. Well guys, what do you think? Personally, I'm pretty curious to see how this all plays out. I feel like this is definitely one of the more serious situations we've seen on this channel. It's one of those things you don't really ever expect to see from somebody that like you watch on the internet. It just goes to show you how dangerous parasocial relationships can be. Stuff like this should just really hammer home the fact that you don't know the people you're watching on the internet. You might feel like you do, you might think some people are especially down to earth, they're especially transparent with who they really are on the internet. They aren't. Everybody's playing a character to some extent, even if you don't mean to. That's just human nature. I would bet a lot of money that most of you guys watching are not the exact same person you are at home alone in your room as you are at work or at school or around your friends. Everybody's a little bit different based off the scenario. We've all got a couple different versions of ourselves living inside. That sounds kind of weird, so I'm gonna stop talking there, okay? See ya.